All right, folks. Welcome to one of our final sessions of the day, Alaska Place Names. My name is Phil White. I'm very happy to welcome you all here. We've got three phenomenal panels, and we're going to start with Roger Pearson, who's a professor of geography emeritus at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and a senior fellow at the Institute of the North. We also have Gregory Weissenberg, a retired Kenai Peninsula School District high school teacher of history and Russian, is now an independent researcher. And then, of course, Dr. Michael James Lutzering is a geospatial analyst, Arctic Coastal Geoscience Lab at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. His 2022 doctoral dissertation examined the 1903 Alaska boundary dispute through GIS-based analysis of historical cartography. So we'll have their panel first, and then I'll introduce the others as we go along. And if you have any questions, you can ask them immediately following their presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. How is you here? Everybody hear us well enough?
A little louder.
A little louder. Okay. Gregory Weissenberg was not able to be with us in person today. Hopefully he is online. He has been visiting the Vida's Bering collection at the Horsens Museum in Denmark at the moment. That's one heck of an excuse for not being here.
He is online.
He is online. Excellent. We call this presentation Perspectives on Russian toponyms because we're going to take a little different approach than the normal of looking at individual toponyms. And instead, we're going to look at some different approaches to toponyms. And in that regard, it'll be a little different and it will not focus on details per se. One of the things that is happening in the whole area of place names or toponyms is first, hearing the name toponym more often than place names. Actually, it's gradual because originally place names was two words. Then for a while it had place names as one word. And now we just switched entirely to toponyms, or not entirely. So our focus is on Russian America up to 1867. We use that as a simple cut line. But we are also going to include British and Spanish explorers because they have, at the same time period, advanced a number of place names. The main source of our information comes from this volume, which is Dictionary of Alaska Place Names by Donald Forth. Gregory and I have been working on this for off and on for a few years. And I think both of us have doubled our arm strength over that time. Forth's work, this volume, came out in 1967. And it was from the Department of Interior. And if you think about it, that was just a few years after the statehood. So I don't know if anybody's ever mentioned it, but really we should say thank you to the Interior Department for that very nice birthday gift. Forth's work was based in part on the U.S. Geological Survey and the Board on Geographic Names. And the Board of Geographic Names was created in 1890, and it was updated with a new Congressional Act, Public Law number 242 in 1945. The idea of that act was to focus on the special needs that they have realized that the Board of Geographic Names needed, which was a standardization of names, spelling, pronunciation, and a number of other important factors that really have helped to modernize the use of place names. One of the features that I'd like to show on this, if we could put this forward, see if I can do it. What's happening?
That's the next slide.
Yeah, that's the laser pointer.
That's
just
that
a
just does
pointer.
the pointer.
It's
I
not,
won't do it.
it's not
Yeah.
an advanced.
Do you want it farther than this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Keep going. There we go. One more. There.
Oh, that's right.
next one up.
Okay.
Thank you. Included in the Board on Geographic Names listing of place names are a number of other features, one of which is something called features. And features is shorthand for geographic features. And what the board has done is to develop specific names with specific criteria. In total, there are 63 geographic features listed for toponyms. So each toponym is going to have its own special place name or feature. So, for example, we're used to toponyms and calling it a name, call it Cook Inlet, but the second part is a water feature. So whether it's a river, lake, whatever it might be, that is the feature that is identified. It's sort of the obverse of place names. It's looking at the place and giving that place a feature name. So I thought it might be interesting for us to take a look at what happens to all of these Russian, Spanish, and British toponyms that we have on our catalog of places. And what you can see here is, if I can get it, we have blue, which is British, red, which is Russian, and yellowish orange, which is Spanish. Notice that of all the some little over 100 or almost 400 toponyms here, the largest grouping was by the British on capes. Secondly, came the Spanish with channels, or capes, also capes. And then next in line are the Russians with islands. I suspect part of the reason for that is that the Russian data includes more of the Aleutian Islands, thus more islands. On the other hand, if you look at these other lists down here, things drop off on the rock really fast here. There are very few what we call summits. Now, if you stop and think about it, there are probably more than 10 or so summits in all of Southeast and Southwest Alaska. Really. So it's not the perfect method for describing the landscape, but it is a really good method for describing the landscape that the explorers are interested in. So if you take a little different twist to your thinking, it makes sense. What we do not classify under the Board on Geographic Names is the actual toponym name. Naming or classifying toponyms has been a long drawn out battle and is still going on. I took a browse through the Journal of Names, which started in the 1950s and is going on today. And I found talks by George Stewart on his personal classification for place names. George Stewart was the fellow who came up with the Alaska Place Names book and also Names on the Land. Well, he couldn't convince everyone, so there have been several iterations since that time. I found a study that came out about over 12 years ago by Australian toponymists. They have gone through a whole research program looking at toponyms in Australia. And I looked at their system and found some pieces of that to be really quite interesting. I looked at one term that they had as part of their classification system. And the term is called eponymous. In Kenai Peninsula language, that would be called honorary or honorary names. And if you think about it, and you glance at a map of, say, Russian maps, British maps, you'll find things like Prince William Sound, whatever it may be. It's an honorary name. And it's very common. In fact, I thought it was quite common. But then I started doing something, which was to take a look at the actual data. So the next slide, we got that already? No, next one. Thank you. What the Australians did was to take a look at the period between 1600 and 1800. And they found 3 countries that were doing extensive exploration. One was the British, no surprise. The second was the Dutch, no surprise. And the third was the French. And what they did was go through their classification system for all of those places that were named by the 3 countries. And then they added up the totals. And they found for eponymous names, of all the names classified, eponymous ended up being about 45% for the British, about 60% for the Dutch, and off the chart, about 81% for the French. So they were out and about to name as many honorary terms as they could for their toponyms. Dutch less, British even less. So then I thought, okay, what about the Russians in Russian America? Here we have, again, the British, the Russians, and the Spanish. How did they come out? British, about 45%, Russians, about 42%, and the Spanish, about 48%. Interestingly, they dropped below what the average was for the earlier time period. Interesting to think about this more global perspective of what's happening to toponyms in colonial areas. Now I'm sort of intrigued to know what's happened elsewhere. But it gives us this sort of global perspective that we otherwise don't get. One of the other things that has happened is that the Board on Geographic Names, which is based on a board of federal organizations, they have updated themselves, and they now have something called the National Geospatial Program, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, among others. And this group of people and organizations has said, we need to update what's going on with mapping. And so if you were to look at the website of the Board on Geographic Names, and you clicked onto Alaska, and you wanted to look at the Alaska data, you click on that, and you find out that the latitude and longitude is now all digital. Not all, but almost. So every place name right now still has the old latitude, longitude, degrees, minutes, seconds, but it also has these point things for using computerized mapping. And so the result is we now have the opportunity to take a look at Alaska's toponyms in a completely different way. And for that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Lettsering.
It's been great to work with Roger and Gregory on this project. We've been working with it for quite a while. I'm gonna have to move ahead a little bit. Let's stay right there really quickly. I'm working with geographic information science. And so of course, we're at this point, we're using satellite-based base maps that then we're taking data and putting it in there. And what we're trying to do, or what I tried to do with the toponym work that I did here, was to try and look at both temporal differences and spatial differences, and maybe see if we can identify signals in that information that might not otherwise be completely visible. Okay, please. I don't have very much time to talk about this map. It's a this is my specialty, is historical cartography, but this is a relatively important colonial map of the region. Most people believe that this is have written that this is almost entirely a copy of Cook, that's where we projected. Well, a lot of tokens, a lot of Cyrillic text on here. But in fact, much of it is annotation, and a lot of it is also copied place names from English sources. On the next slide, please. The key to why we think that this is a copy is large blank spot here, up here. And these kinds of errors are useful in identifying the sources of maps. If you look at the Cook version, you see that it's quite familiar. The last one, of course, the big difference in the Russian map is that Cook doesn't have a Shelikof Strait, and that's because he just the limits of the survey that they did. Next slide, please. So the information that I was able to get from Gregory and from Roger came in this form, the Excel spreadsheet that had been digitized from ORTH and had positions. And then I ingested it into our GIS system and get something that looks like this. This isn't this is nearly an automated step, although there are things that you have to know to do it. Next slide, please. One of the things that's really clear immediately is that there is a very limited number of Russian toponyms before 1799. And this comes as something of a surprise, particularly when we look at, for instance, the number of English tokens, English source tokens in the same time frame. If we go even a little closer or go in detail to this region here, we start seeing Spanish place names showing up in the same time frame. This is a Spanish summary map from that actually was a product from the Malaspina expedition. A lot of this information is actually the original Spanish survey, but a lot of place names here. Some of them were preserved, some were not. These are, for instance, the examples up to 1790 and the pilots that were behind the place names. Wanted to go a little further with this and have some fun with some statistical analysis. Find geostatistical analysis fun. This is all of our place names. And please go ahead. Down in this area, for instance, there's a big blank spot of Russian information for 1800. However, the Russians caught up quite quickly by mid-18th century. This map is a monument of Russian colonial cartography, and it is actually produced by a Creole Alaskan. The cartographer behind this, his name is Kashparov. His mother was from Kodiak, his father was Russian. He was trained in St. Petersburg in celestial navigation and cartography methods. And he was behind this Russian Admiralty series of maps from the mid-19th century. Slide, please. When we look in detail, there's a great amount of geographic information, not only toponyms, but there's topographic information, mountain peaks that were important for coastal navigators, but also displayed that there was certainly behind us, there was a lot of indigenous informants in the creation of this map.
Sorry, they're just saying online, when you turn, it's hard to hear you. I know you have to look at the map. I know.
Okay, so I will only turn. But these are all of the Russian source toponyms up to 1867 in Southeast Alaska. Took a look at this and I thought, well, there seems to be a great concentration of information just coming from this small geographic area. How can I dig into this further? Next slide, please. So I took these Russian point data toponym locations. Next, please. And I added what's called a buffer. This is very simple. It's a circle. In this case, I used about a 60-mile circle, which could represent influence, could represent the reach of the Russian American Company, if you will. What this does, though, for the analysis, is that it turns points into polygons. Once I have polygon shapes, we can find where, for instance, they overlap with other polygons that represent, for instance, England and Spain. So this looks like quite a bit of a map. if you look at on a bigger scale, you get a little bit of an idea of the colonial cartographic developments of these three colonial powers. But then I take it a step further and see what the intersections mean. And this is what I got. I used what is called a polygon pairwise intersection. And this looks just for overlapping information and then weights it with a number of intersections. So this is kind of interesting, but what does it mean, right? Well, one thing it means for certain is that this is the biggest geographic concentration of colonial tokens in the entire, what we now call Alaska. But it's also, you know, you can say about this that, well, this is contested space, real contested space. You know, key to this entire region is colonial resistance to the Russian American Company and how that formed and created diplomatic crises between the United States, Spain, England, leading to the boundary dispute, which I wrote my doctoral dissertation about. If we look at it a little closer, you can see it's actually a little bit surprising. Also, it's certainly there's geographic aspects to this, of course, about the distance to colonial power centers, such as the west coast of Mexico, eastern Russia, and to English maritime power, searches for the Northwest Passage, and of course the project of harvesting, harvesting skins and trading with the indigenous Alaskans. And I'll just end with this, this is the first official United States map of the Northwest Territory, or what was Tsarist Russian territory in the Americas. 183 tokens in this, but there's one missing. Can anybody see what that is? Alaska. Yeah, Alaska. So this map was actually made rapidly, like within 3 weeks of Seward signing the treaty, and they had not decided to call it Alaska yet. Now, the other 183 tokens that are there are mostly looking from English maps. There's very, very few Spanish tokens or Russian tokens, and some of them are completely different from what we know today. But this is like a clean slate that started with the United States treaty session. So all the tokens that we have are from here. Unfortunately. Unfortunately not. And that's all I have right now.
Questions for our panelists?
Just for Roger, are the eponyms, do they include saints' names or are they honorific for actual people like princes and so forth?
There's a whole variety.
So you would include saints' names in the
Yes,
eponyms?
yes.
Okay. Yeah.
We try to be holistic.
So would the US Department of Interior work now to change names that we currently deem offensive affect your work, and were other countries assigning toponyms that we now consider offensive and which may go away?
I can speak to that slightly, since my actual job now is I work for the Office of Archaeology and History for the state of Alaska. And yes, there is an ongoing program to change derogatory place names. It's large. It's a large program, and it's time.
The Kashivara map and your ability to zoom in on that, I don't think I've ever had an image that, and have you been able to determine? I don't believe that Tom Thornton's Tlingit place names was able to tap into that, and then where you would look at how many of those are truncated? Can you determine that?
That's what we're working on next. Try to get Gregory, working on.
Well,
translating Capybara.
Expect a phone call.
Well, Garrett has had access to that map, but these are real interesting issues about. And whether or not we can optimize those in Photoshop and so on too.
Well, it's very, the copies I have are very high resolution. I got them from Mark, Falk, Dr.
Oh,
Falk.
right,
And
right.
so, and Dr. Falk and Dr. Posnikov, maybe the book they worked on together. Posnikov really believes that at that time period, at least, that particularly Capybara was trying to preserve, and other indigenous placenames.
Right,
In their maps.
Yeah, I think well, I don't specifically work with that data set.
Yeah.
Yeah, well-
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on Jim's comment. When I saw that concentration of place names, it didn't strike me as unusual. But the questions it raised in my mind was, what is a geographic placement there that allowed that? What was the reasons behind it? And then how would that relate to the Goldschmidt and Haas work that was done early on in terms of place names, and that Thornton then took up and expanded on? Because then we might be able to explain the significance of those particular concentrations in terms of the environmental resources and in terms of the trading possibilities and the Aboriginal settlement.
Well, I would say that there's, maybe familiar with the entire idea of a political imaginary and the colonial imaginary. And that there was a great deal of survey work done there by a very limited number of colonial mariners, particularly Vancouver, and also the Spanish did some very concentrated work in Southeast Alaska. So that is part of the signal that you're getting there. Why there's that concentration there. It was much more difficult for England and Spain to reach Western Alaska than it was the Alexander Archipelago of that region. So that's at work for sure. But there is no question that there was great Tlingit resistance. There were many people sailing in that area through that period that were not necessarily British Navy, Russian American company. So it was a magnet, if you will, for colonial activities, and nautical charting was an important priority.
Yeah, we certainly know that Sitka and Yakutat were, in your terms, contested space.
Well, yes, absolutely. Well, no, that's another speech entirely, another presentation entirely, talking about that era of Russian America and the other Europeans up to certainly the 1830s.
I have a quick
Rachel, yeah.
point. I noticed that places they don't seem to include trails or ways of getting from one place to another, and that might be something that'll come up in talking about the indigenous place names, that there's more names for ways to move than there are, but yeah, so no answer needed, just a comment.
I have time for one or two more. If we can make them quick, we'll fit in both.
Okay, I just wanted to know if the dispute with Canada that was resolved in the 70s on the border on southeast was a result of some of this, and was Wrangell
Next
a
slide.
part of this map?
There you go. So this is a direct, I believe, in my dissertation, I argued that this dispute is a direct result of Tlingit resistance, forcing Russia to take a fairly draconian position with the Ukazi of 1821, and then the red line being the Canadian claim and the blue line being the American claim. That blue line, by the way, was completely fabricated by the U.S. It was copied literally right off of the British Admiralty chart. which was kind of clever.
I was wondering if you had a category for indigenous names that were transliterated early by the European.
Roger?
Not yet.
Okay.
If I could add one real quick comment. One of the other things we could do with this GIS is to show individual expeditions of the explorers. We can show, that is over time. So over time, we could test out the historical geographer James Gibson's comment about the lateness and lameness of Russian exploratory activity in North America. So you can actually time your map to show the movement of the Russians onto this landscape. Good for school.
All righty, next up, we have Garrett Verby, who is a resident of Anchorage with interests in history, languages, mountaineering, cartography, and data engineering. Currently works as a municipal planner for the Matanuska-Susitna Borough.
Thanks, folks. So as mentioned, my name is Garrett Verbeek. I'm here today to tell you about a project that I've been working on for 7 years called Chauce Lore. And I think this is particularly relevant to this theme of connections and disconnections in Alaskan history, as we'll see it involves all sorts of connections. But before we get into it, I would like to just thank all of you for a very warm welcome. As you'll hear in a minute, I don't have a background in history. I don't have a background in anthropology, nothing in social science. My background is engineering and recreational mountaineering, which has some advantages for this project, but in any case, it's an honor to even be given a seat at the table, and I'm really appreciative. I was delighted to learn recently that the Dena'ina word for anthropologist from Dr. Carey's topical Dena'ina dictionary is Suk Kutanach Kakaimalahan, and that translates to one who examines old people. So, by that measure, at this point, I might have an honorary degree because this project has brought me into contact with all sorts of elders from all over the states. Next slide. So the project is Chauce Lore. The first question is, well, what is Chauce, especially for people who aren't in recreational mountaineering? And for those who don't know, Chauce is a term to describe this quality of rock that is brittle and untrustworthy and treacherous. This is a photo of some friends and I on a particularly Chaucey peak in the Chugach State Park called Beelzebub. And as you can see, it is steep, it is loose, everything is just waiting to come loose in your hand. In many cases, it's unprotectable, because even if you tie a rope to the rock, if the rock goes, well, you're lost. Aaron Leggett from the Anchorage Museum had the very astute question of, okay, well, what's the difference between Chauce and scree, where scree is kind of a more recognized term. Chauce is kind of more of a description for an actual mountain, and once it kind of comes loose and piles up, then it's scree. So here you can see a very Chaucey scree-filled landscape. And that then begs the question, okay, what is Chauce Lore? So Chauce, as you can tell, is not a very desirable characteristic in mountaineering, right? It's something that people do not want to be on compared to nice granite or trustworthy rock. And kind of this carries over a little bit to that's the idea of Chauce Lore, where there aren't many people, like Chauce characterizes the Kenai Mountains and the Chugach Mountains, and there aren't many people who are devoted to these places, but the ones who are fiercely devoted. So for me, the idea of Chauce Lore and mountaineering is very deeply intertwined. When I started doing this back in 2015, I had a mentor who had a little bit more experience, or a lot more experience in the outdoors than I did. And he would ask me if I'd been to certain places, and he would say, hey, have you been to Dragon Tail Ridge yet? Have you been to Peril Peak? Have you been to the Shroud? And these names captured me, right? They kind of allow you to think about a place in a way that you can't think about it if you don't know what the place is named. And they fascinate you, and they allow you to kind of have a sense of ownership and stewardship. And they have a very, a subtle but strong influence on the way that we perceive places. So for instance, we're on the shores of Cook Inlet. I invite you to take a very brief second to imagine how that might feel different for you if instead of Cook Inlet, it was Sandwich Sound, which was Captain Cook's preferred name, or even Zaliv Kuka in Russia, or Kungachik in Suksum, or Tecumseh in Dena'ina. How would just those subtle name changes feel different? And I can tell you, for instance, I dared to climb Mount Pleasant years before I dared to climb Peril Peak. These things happen out. So if we can advance. So this is a real website. And the idea is, what if we had a free public digital atlas online where you could scroll around a map of Alaska and you could see every single named creek. You can see peaks, you can see ski runs, glaciers, bays, and if you clicked on them, you could bring up a very short description. So in this case, we're looking at Lowell Creek out towards kind of the Nelchina region. You get a very brief summary, but then you click to read more, and it brings you to a narrative history article of where these names came from. We can advance the slide. This started as a dream for the Chugach State Park, because as I mentioned, I'm a recreational mountaineer, and it kind of expanded and expanded and expanded. You think, okay, well, that's interesting, I should just write it down. I finally drawn my hard limits. This is for any single feature between the Susitna rivers and the Copper rivers as they kind of arc together along the Gulf Canal. And there are 3,500 official place names in that area of interest, which includes the Kenai Peninsula and Prince William Sound. No one on earth knows how many unofficial names, right? There are ones in use by hunters, by the native communities, by pilots, by skiers, by mountaineers, by boaters. Every single community brings their names. And it turns out collecting these names is a very fascinating way to teach Alaskan history comprehensively. These things touch everything, right? We've seen them touch biography, we've seen them touch ecology, we've seen them touch like global demographic shifts. And if you start examining this network of names in a given place, you really quickly learn the patterns of how people came in. And it's very democratic, right? The rich and poor are responsible for names, men, women, every ethnicity, every income level, everything you can imagine. So my goal is to capture all of these. Slide, please. I'm not the first person to dream this. Obviously, when I talk about this thing, one of the first things that will come to many of your minds is, oh, well, we've got Donald North, who did an excellent amount of work. We have folks like Mary J. Berry, who was not necessarily focused on toponyms, but she was such a freaking good scholar that she just unearthed those things as she went anyway. And even before then, as it turns out, telling stories that are connected to place names is an extraordinarily Dene thing to do. And we're on Dena'ina territory. So in a lot of senses, folks like Peter Kalifornsky and Shen Pete are very much spiritual grandfathers of this project, this telling stories about geographic place names. And as it happens, it also turns out that carrying heavy packs through the wilderness is also a very Dene thing to do. And this idea of deeply knowing your backcountry is a very Dene thing to do. So I kind of feel like I've landed in the right place. I'm horrible at kayaking and I'm not a very accurate thrower, so I'm grateful to be mostly on Dene territory rather than Alutiiq territory, because I would be laughed out of the lunchroom in the Alutiiq world. We got the next slide. So today I'm here to tell you about two stories and how these place names came to be, and kind of walk through the research process. I'm here to tell you about the birds and the bees. Wait, scratch that. The penguins and the grasshoppers. Close. So to begin with, we'll be talking about a feature which is smack dab in the middle of this map, where we have a satellite photo of Turnagain Arm. Anchorage is up here, Kenai Peninsula, and then it goes into a hillshade just so we can kind of see the topography a little bit better. And for those of you who might know, this creek that runs back here is called Penguin Creek in English. We have never been able to find a Dena'ina name for it or a Sugpiaq name for it, but there is no doubt that those existed. And here is a really quick example of the importance of how toponyms kind of teach us things. We know that this area would be a landmark for both the Alutiiq culture and the Dena'ina culture. We know that because if we look at the Dena'ina names, we see stuff like the Chena Chakalev, which is where the Alutiiq emerged from, Portage Pass. And we know there was bidirectional traffic from a huge variety of sources. Going up the coast, we have Chena Tishklut, which is where we killed the Alutiiq people. So there was obviously quite a bit of bicultural traffic in this area. And then if we look at, these are two massive travel corridors historically, which you might recognize as Indian Creek from the Arctic to Indian ski run. And then this goes up Bird Creek. And in Dena'ina, they're called Esbeitnu, which is Sheep River or Sheep Creek, and Nuti Edufeni, which is that which flows to saltwater.
Goat Creek.
Goat Creek, thank you. Thank you, Jay. But Nuti Edufeni is that which flows to saltwater. And if we think for a second, all of these creeks flow to saltwater. So the fact that this one was the one that the Dena'ina looked at and said, that's the one, tells you a little bit about the importance of that travel corridor. And the fact that it's named Indian Creek in English, when everything was Indian territory, that they looked at that creek and said, that one is Indian Creek, tells you how important that was to these people. Next slide. Thank you. We're gonna try something fancy. One more thing. Aha. Eventually, the Americans came in, and as we know, that's kind of around 1894 was when Americans made the first commercial gold strike on turning an arm. Kind of in the 1898 timeframe, we have the Glenn expedition, and in 1899 with the Lieutenant Heron expedition, that's when this Penguin Creek was first described. And if we check Orth, we get, oh, Penguin Creek was a local name recorded in 1899 by Lieutenant Heron. But that's not the story. That's not where it came out. Why penguins? Out of all of these creeks, right? We have, by coincidence, we have this theme of Bird Creek, Penguin Creek, Crow Creek, Raven Creek, Eagle River. These were early English names. And if we fast forward, what that has spawned is an entire constellation of bird-themed names in use by the local backcountry mountaineering community. We have stuff like along Penguin Ridge, which is this classic mountaineering route. We have Penguin Creek, a Daily Point, Chinstrap, Gentoo, Crested. We've got the corvids up here. We've got the kinglets, the wing, the anatomical stuff. This has all spawned this really fascinating pattern of names. So understanding how penguin got into the mix would be pretty fun. Now let's see if we can track it down. Let me get a slide. And this, just to bring it back to mind, that this is a real place. These are photos of Penguin Ridge by a mountaineering friend of mine named Andrew Holman. It's a beautiful route into Girdwood. That mountain has a way of just like catching the clouds. It's really unique. Most ridges and creeks off of Jernigan Arm flow perpendicularly straight off into the uplands. And Penguin Creek is the only one that kind of runs parallel to the coast. And it just has this way of capturing clouds that's really beautiful. So, as many of you are very familiar with, history involves looking at a huge variety of sources. And we're just going to kind of keep track of these sources and this little cartouche over here as we go. And the first source, in 2004, the Alaska DNR did something that was phenomenal. They ran around the entire state and they scanned in all of the district reporters' books, which before basically Alaska had a government, this was where you recorded mining claims and marriages and everything. But the mining claims are interesting, especially if you toponym research, because oftentimes prospectors were the first people into a given area, and they had a huge incentive to keep very good records. Because if you strike it rich and you can't prove that that's your claim, you're host. The problem with this is these are hundreds and hundreds of pages of just scans. They're not indexed. They're not, there's no way to really know what kind of content. There's no way to search for the content. At least I have an index now. If you'd like that, please come talk to me. But we start just kind of reading these things. And this is how these stories come together. So as you're reading, Sunrise Mining District Book 2, page 88, we come across a claim. And if you'll recall, Penguin Creek is a tributary of Bird Creek. And here, on May 5th, 1896, William McIntyre makes a claim. And he describes it as situated on the right-hand branch of Bird Creek. You think, okay, that's interesting. It's probably Penguin Creek. I'll write that down. Next slide. Months later, completely different book. Now we're off in Jernigan Mining District, book 64, page 128. May 6th, the very next day, a guy named Frederick Richardson comes through, and all of a sudden he's on Penguin Creek, the same being the lower east branch of Bird Creek. And you think, something happened there. I don't know what, but May 5th to May 6th, something happens. And then kind of, we don't need to go back, but the district reporter on the first claim was a guy named Sanford Mills, who some of you might recognize. He was a very well-respected reporter. He knew what was going on. And if there had been a name that he was aware of for that creek, he would have filled it in. So the fact that he didn't fill it in, and now it's here the next day, tells something. Next slide, please. So if we look around the same pages, we kind of come up with this series of claims that's recorded on May 6, 1896 by the same party. And this party involves Frederick Richardson, William Gleason, Auckland White, Mumbine, and Bizarre, who some of you might also recognize as a well-known name around here. These names all become jumping off points for research, right? You can then go search Chronicling America, Happy Trust, like all of the sources, they become options. And in this case, Martin Chester actually turned out to be a pretty significant person. But we're still trying to track that down. So, okay, we have some idea of when Penguin Creek might have emerged, but we still don't know what was with penguins. So, next slide. So we keep on going and keep on trawling through information. And we've gone from district reporters' books. Now we're off in the Anchorage Library reading travelogues from 1903. This was Summer and Fall in Western Alaska by a guy named Colonel Claude Kane. At the very end of it, he's waiting for a ship out in Soldovia, and as a little aside, he says, hey, there are a lot of mirrors here, which are known locally as penguins. And you think to yourself, oh, well, could that be it? Maybe. So Anchorage Public Library, this is not a digitized book. It's not available anywhere else except in print at a library. So thanks to the library for that. So I said, okay, we'll take that information and we'll go to our expert friends. I don't know much about birds, but I have a lot of friends who do, and people who are enthusiastic about anything usually love to share their knowledge. So you start bouncing ideas off people and they say, okay, could it have been mirrors out in that area? And I say, well, no, you know, mirrors are diving birds. They go for clear water. Turning an arm is really too silky. And they say, no, it doesn't really quite fit there. And someone says, well, maybe it could be mirrorlets. And you say, okay, well, we'll put a pin in that for now. So next slide. But then years later, reading through Chronicling America, which is a fantastic resource, and you come across this newspaper article. And it says, a vessel will leave this port for Cook Inlet on May 1st, 1896. The schooner Penguin, which has just been built, is going to sail under command of Captain Chester. It's going to land passengers any place they wish in Cook Inlet, and then move on. And if we can move forward, just to summarize the timeline. We've got May 1st is when this new ship, the Penguin, under command of Captain Chester, is going to leave for Cook Inlet. On May 5th, 1896, 4 days later, there is still no recorded name for this creek. And then the next day, a party which also involves Martin T. Chester names this creek Penguin Creek. And this research does occasionally involve leaps of faith. I would hang my reputation that this is the anatomy of a penguin. This is where the name Penguin Creek became associated with that creek. And who would have thought that we could find this down to like literally probably the exact day that it was done. So this is kind of, now imagine doing this for every single place name. Fantastic. So now we're going to bounce north a little bit, and we're going to look at an area that's kind of on the north side of Anchorage. You may recognize Palmer. We're going off towards Lake George. And side notes, Lake George has frustrated me for years. If anybody knows who George is, please tell me. It appears on an 1898 map just off in the little corner. This is Lake George. No explanation given. Then Eklutna Lake, Meadow Creek, Knickarm, and Stapleton. So question, how many of you guys know of a feature named for grasshoppers in this general area? Who's ever heard of the grasshoppers back here? Nobody. And how many people associate grasshoppers with Alaska? Not many people. But if we're looking through topographic maps, just looking and looking and looking, eventually we find this thing. We're gonna do something fancy again. Please, one more time. And just back here on a topographic map from the 60s, there's just this little thing that says, hey, this is Grasshopper Valley. And the history of Knik River is much, much more fuzzy. Basically, 1896 was the height of the Cook Inlet Gold Rush. That was when prospectors were pushing off into up the Knik River, up the Susitna. It was also the year of the first known English-speaking hunting expedition up the Knik River. The Knik River was, of course, used by the Dena'ina Athabascans for millennia, but it is unlikely that Grasshopper is connected to them. 1898, there's a frustrating map that I mentioned where it just says, hey, this is Lake George, so there must have been kind of some knowledge of that area. 1903 is the earliest known claim that I've been able to find on Meadow Creek. And 57 years later, the federals, basically there was a federal record of Grasshopper Valley. And once again, we turn to Orth, and Orth says, oh, this was a local name reported in 1960 by the USGS. Good luck. Which I have a huge admiration for Donald Ward. As someone held up his dictionary, it is 1,087 pages long, if I remember right. So that's about the limit of what you can bind. He only had a sentence per feature. And on top of that, it wasn't his job to track these things down, although I'm sure he had extensive notes. But we're going to make it our job to track these darn things down. And if Penguin Creek was the story of bringing together all these different text sources, from mining claims to books to that type of thing, Penguin Creek is one that just kind of like fell into my lap all of a sudden. And in this case, hey, we're looking at newspapers.com, which is now a paid newspapers archive. And all of a sudden, in 1935, in the Nome Daily Nugget of all places, there's something that says grasshoppers are tough in Alaska. And it tells these stories of Mr. and Mrs. W. Peterson of Nashua, New Hampshire, and their guide Lee Waddell flew out there for a day thinking they were gonna hunt. They got swarmed by grasshoppers that ate all of their gear and they flew out the next day. So if Penguin Creek was talking about the gold rush, now we're spiraling off into all these different subjects of, 1935, the chartered hunting flights. I think 1927 was the first aircraft in Alaska and Fairbanks. Is that right?
1913 was the first.
13, okay, fair enough. Okay, then it's not quite as fast as I thought, but people were on this recreational aviation stuff surprisingly fast. But this is where, if we can go forward one. So then we start saying, okay, well, we also have now these names, these Lee Waddell is a guy, and then the Petersons or other people. And first we find Lee Waddell in the Anchorage Museum. So we have this passport photo in the Lou Liston collection. But this is where it gets interesting because the coolest thing about history is this ties into real life. These are still real people. Their grandkids are running around. You can contact them. So we look around and we look on Facebook. We look for Lee Waddell on Facebook. And here in our Historical Homer Alaska Facebook group, some of you may be members of, we have our very own Enid Pools. They say, oh, well, my uncle Lee Waddell was buried there in the early 50s, talking about the graveyard. So we can talk to these people and we can get their memories. And Clark Fair is also in the audience. And he says, oh, hey, well, this, I suppose, sister-in-law of Lee Waddell was his babysitter in the early 1960s. So you can go talk to these people. You can send them an email and they will respond. We have the Petersons. And you think, okay, if someone could afford a chartered hunting flight in 1935, that's the type of family that still keeps their records around. So you do a little digging and you find out, okay, well, it turns out they were the parents of a governor of New Hampshire. Their grandson is still alive. You send them an email and they write back, oh, we got your message. We've got the journals from the trip. We've got the 16mm film reels from that trip that is in Alaska in 1935, the founding year of the Matanuska colony, a really early year for Anchorage. And you have to say, okay, imagine how much of this stuff, imagine how much of Alaska's history was primarily documented by tourists who then took it off into all these little corners of the US and it's tucked away in some little archive, it's tucked away on 35mm slides in someone's closets. And if we don't try to kind of claw it back, it's going to be lost really, really quick. These things really get lost quickly. But that is, especially given this article identifies it as an unnamed valley at the time, somewhere in here, a nameless valley, I would submit that that is the origin of Grasshopper Valley. And we legitimately have now the diaries and the 16mm film that has only been seen by like 2 or 3 people that we can just put up online and anyone can look at this thing. So this kind of brings it full circle. A lot of the times it's talking to the right people. And that's one of the reasons why I'm coming to youth, because my challenge is figuring out who the heck to talk to. These stories are often in the memories of like, oh, you got to go talk to, Susan who lives at the end of the road and she's the homesteader's granddaughter and you have to talk to her and not her sister because her sister is shy. Those type of things are how you track down these stories. And right now, as I'm sure you're aware, we're losing people who remember the 40s, 50s, and 60s at a crazy rate. And that is a lot of where the English-speaking geographic names come in. So one last slide. No, we're good with that. Can we go back one? So, okay, it turns out grasshoppers are indigenous to Alaska, which I had no idea of. And it's most likely this Melanopolis sanguinipes, the migratory grasshopper, and devastating grasshopper. And their description is literally, oh, this is one of the most damaging grasshopper species in North America. So this spirals off. Now we got to go talk to entomologists of like, okay, was this specific to 1935? Is it geographically specific? How does this work? It spirals off into linguistics. Some of you might recognize that sanguinipes is sanguine, which is related to blood in Latin. How the heck did that get associated with the species? So this is just, for me, and for I think many of the brains that are in this room, this is addictive. Like this is basically every single day, go learn about X, go learn about caribou, go learn about folklore connected to birds, go learn about the Cold War, go learn about, British military expeditions in the 1800s. You can get sucked in, and I want you guys to get sucked in. So last slide. The goal, this is a live website. It is up and running right now. It is at www.chosler.com. The 2 aspects of this are, this atlas is the kind of the heritage of all Alaskans. My intent is never put behind a paywall. It will always be free. However, I want to start bringing in guest authors, right? For one, I do not have the time to write 10,000 articles. I'll be dead long before then. But two, a lot of these stories aren't mine to tell. Like I can write something for Mount Marathon, but it won't be the same as someone who is in a multi-generational family down in Seward, who is deeply attached to the mountain writing it. I want folks like Catherine McNamara to talk about California. I want Joel Isaac for Kasilov. I want folks like Stephen Haycox and Tom Kazaya, Julia O'Malley, the people who care and are good communicators and have deep roots, so that this can be a showcase of love for Alaska. In the background though, we've seen how many sources I trawl through, and I've been actually really surprised and honored that several of the presentations over the last couple of days have referenced material which I believe this project first turned up and sent to them. I need to organize this stuff. So as you guys, if anyone attended Russ Vanderluck's presentation the other day, he was mentioning how Dick Pierce passed away. His stuff is essentially gone. We don't know where his notes are anymore. And you can build up so much knowledge, and if it doesn't get passed on, then it doesn't really do any good. So in the background, because I come from an engineering thing, I put together a database called Cairn, because Cairn is organized charts, right? Stacked on top of each other. And this is a way to organize reference material and to cross-reference it with people, with geographic features, with data information, and with themes. So you can start doing stuff like say, hey, show me every single mention of this person across all these different books, or show me any instance of these two people interacting, or show me any photo of the Matanuska Glacier organized chronologically. And I'm trying to turn this into a 501c3 over the course of the next year. The two ways to do that are to either get 3 directors, so hints to all of you guys, or to work under the umbrella of an existing 501c3, hints to the Alaska Historical Society. I would love to put this under you guys as a project. I do think there's a real path towards generating tens of thousands of dollars for expanding the atlas and for funding digitization and preservation of all of these collections, which, you know, if we have film that's in Juneau or a logbook that's in the National Archives in Maryland or stuff in Denver, stuff in Seattle, it's functionally inaccessible because plane tickets are really friggin' expensive and we don't have free time. So if we can digitize this stuff, it protects it against fires and floods and that type of thing, and it also just makes it more accessible for all of the researchers, all of you. So that's my spiel. I'm going to be working on this for the rest of my life. But I would really love to have more involvement. This is at a critical mass to really build into something for Alaska. So thank you for listening.
Questions? Yeah.
I first heard about Garrett when he asked me to write a reference for an unsuccessful NEH fellowship, and he sent me early drafts of the Chaucer lore. But I wanted to get on that Martin Chester, and apologies to Martin Chester, because we said in Shempete's book that it was Chauncey, and it was anglicized from Chaucer to Chester. And in fact, I think it was named for Chester himself.
We did not, we haven't found the smoking gun for that yet. There is an undated map, which is credited to Chester, the first known nautical map of Turnagain Arm. I cannot find a copy of that anywhere. So I'm not, a lot of this stuff, I have suspicions of where these names came from, but I'm not going to publish anything until I can really hang my hat on it. We haven't found a smoking gun for that yet. But anyway, I would also like to say Dr. Perry is a hero of mine, and I really appreciate your support. It is. Thank you.
Time for 1 or 2 questions. Jump in. Does anybody, where are Orth's notes? Do we know?
I don't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I don't know where Mary J. Berry's notes are. I believe her son is still alive in Fairbanks.
yeah.
So many of these people you built up, yes.
The Resurrection Bay Historical Society has 15 baker's boxes of Mary Berry.
Okay, so that's one thing.
We're waiting for someone to help us archive it all.
And that's also like half the battle, and the reason for this database is I work for the Matsu Borough. We have a fireproof room full of stuff. Resurrection Bay Historical Society has a basement full of stuff. All these museums have archives, and half the battle is just knowing what exists and where. So if we could get that organized, I think that would really supercharge a lot of research and a lot of different angles.
Right?
Just a quick note on grasshoppers.
Yes, ma'am. Please.
Sandhill cranes love them, and it's entertaining to just watch them chase grasshoppers and eat, and then dance their celebration.
Wow. Which part of Alaska do you tend to see that in? Have you seen that in?
We have a farm on a trail 9 miles off Parks Highway.
Hmm.
It's directly west of Clear Air Force Station or whatever its current name is.
Can you repeat that, what she said?
She has a farm that's 9 miles off of the Alaska Highway around
Parkside.
Clear, where the Sandhill cranes serve.
Parks Highway.
Oh, Parks Highway, thank you, of course.
Yeah, Eric.
I was gonna say, I met Orth a couple of years ago, it's about 5 years ago, when we kept meticulous records. I imagine the Department of Interior or the Board of Geographic Names must have. There's probably an answer. The gentleman that does the historic bar crawl usually, who's not here this year, he also worked with the Geographic Names Information System, so I'm sure he would know. I don't know if he's on the call or anything, but Doug Vandergraaf.
Oh, I've heard his name, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you so much. All right, so for our final panel, we've got James Carey, who's a professor of linguistics emeritus at the Alaska Native Language Center at UAF. And we also have Jared Smith, PhD, who's currently an assistant professor at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Sorry.
Anchorage.
Oh, University of Alaska Anchorage in anthropology and geography department. He has 15 years of experience working across Alaska as an archaeologist and has worked closely with Dr. Carey to map traditional place names in the state since 2012.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna do some of the introductory slides, and then Jared did about 4 slides that say more about the web map. And the future of this is somewhat ambiguous. It's not affiliated with any university department. It has not been grant funded. This is the best URL if you have it by invitation, and it's open, and Esri seems to be looking the other way because it is the largest database of contiguous indigenous names, like for 12 place names in the same language family, apparently anywhere in the world. And I'm not exactly sure what the best optimum pattern or future would be, but some of the, like a 501c status might be something. Let's go to the next slide. That's the first picture of me in May of '72 when my ex-wife and I were here for about 2.5 weeks in Kenai, and that changed my life really. And then that's an early picture with Shem Pete in about 1978, where I had about 12 quads taped together, and I had these Mylar labels on there, and he's talking about it at the bilingual conference in Anchorage. And let's go to the next slide. Now, let's do some little background. Now we have official names such as say Chenilna Creek or Talkeetna River, for example, and that's a Dena'ina origin name we can tell because the Dena'ina say Talkeetna, but the Atna say Ikdakuna, and Q is food is stored, and it means the same, and it's a bilingual regular vowel shift, so that's the accurate name. And so then we have, or even this one, it's nice, Tanzona River is from Heron, and it's Tanzuna in little, which is actually for little tunnels, and this is the sound they use for calling muskrats. Smooch, and is an onomatopoetic verb, and then we get into the fact that I in Upper Kuskokwim and it is E and Dena'ina and we have disconnections between the practical writing systems in the different languages when we do networks of names juxtaposed. That's no problem. They're regular, and you start to learn each language, your favorite language. So these now, like Netyeser Ridge, is the official name, actually since 2013 for at the University of, or no, 2011 for Netyeser Ridge. That's the ridge at essentially at the nexus of Glacial Lake Ottman, which we can only jump to briefly here. Trot Yidda is the official name of what had been unnamed, but something like College Hill, for example, is a local colloquial name. So, and then you have a derogatory name, which is actually Sachin Yat, that was changed in 2014. So let's go to the next one. This is the only statute in the state, and it happened in 1982, and it was unanimous in the Senate and House that for unnamed features, we would give preference to establish indigenous place names in a writing system that's being used by the Alaska Native Language Center. People don't know about this, but that's the only statute. And now let's go next. So there's so many issues here, and that are spin-offs for this, but I've developed my own methods for trying to keep cumulative place names lists, and I've used everything from sketch maps to speakers to finding old sources of sketch maps by native speakers to transcribing audio tapes of what I call travel routes or travel arrays. Arrays can be sort of discontinuous naming for places. And then the cornerstone of my work is combining place names lists with band label dictionary files, and it becomes rather powerful. And you don't need to bother putting all the place names in a dictionary. You just put them in there when they're kind of flashy and colorful. But the Dene place names are analyzable and etymologizable more than 99% of the time. There's a great way to appreciate this as your own self-learning goes, and there's all kinds, even more all the time, of derivative products that we can look at, and I'm especially big on signage and place names in tourism, educational tourism, landscape tourism. We really have great potential. And I think this is where Jared's going to come. This is unrehearsed, of course.
Yeah, so this is how the initial web page opened up. We had originally in 2017. Before that, I lived in Fairbanks, and so when Jim and I would need to begin digitizing and mapping all of his extensive place name lists, it was really relatively easy to do. After 2017, I moved down to Anchorage for a couple of years to take work down there, and so we could no longer get together on a regular basis. So I ended up putting everything up on ArcGIS Online so that we could begin to collaborate at any time we wanted, and we could both be looking at the place names at the same time, editing them as well. Thing is about ArcGIS Online is it has to either be free and open source, and you're just paying for it on a personal user license, or if you're going to close it off to other people, as probably many of you know, keep it to an organization or something, you have to start paying exorbitant fees for that. So anyways, I've been able to set it up so that it's not really searchable unless you're already an ArcGIS expert, or dangerous at least in getting there. So if you have an ArcGIS Online account, you can find these maps, but your average person who doesn't really understand how ArcGIS works can't. And this is the protections we have for a lot of these sites that are more sacred or describing village sites that people who are less scrupulous aren't going to go out and desecrate or dig. So, anyways, Kraus and everyone, his colleagues published that wonderful map through ANLA that shows traditional territories in Alaska and adjacent Canada. Once we began mapping these extensive place name lists with what I did with Jim, and I realized that we were actually getting very detailed information of the borderlands between all of these languages and bands. And so I ended up incorporating a lot of the place names I could find for Yupik, Sugpiat, Inuit, so that I could also tighten up the borderlands around the edges of the Dene language area. And so you can now see when we compare Kraus and his team's place territory map, traditional territory map, with what is informed by our place names, which we have 25,000 place names now informing this traditional place names. We get to some really interesting differences, especially when it comes to how we map Dayton. The Canadian languages, especially that one, is looking quite wildly different from what was previously mapped. We're still working on this area quite a lot, so got a pile of work ahead. We'll switch to the next one. So that's what I'm hoping to publish this map with Jim once we really feel like our borders are real and firm and not really changing. But again, this is the area that I'm kind of focused on now. So hopefully we'll have a product that we can get out soon. Yeah, so I'll hand this over to.
Well, this is mine.
Oh, no, this was mine. Yeah. So a couple of things about the place names that I thought maybe would be interesting for the Historical Society was how the native Dene place names were influencing the initial English place names. We have statistically the same amount of Dene place names in Alaska as we have in English, official English place names in Alaska. Just a little bit less on the Dene side, but we have, when we, I think it's like just a matter of a couple hundred differences at this point, about 12 to 13,000. So what's interesting is that in the Dene area, we have approximately 12,000 Dene place names, approximately 13,000 English place names. There's only about 1,100 of those place names that actually are describing the same name feature between English and Dene. So both languages are actually really focused on naming different landscape features and focus on different landscape features. So we have, as Alaska continues to develop the official place names of the state, we have a whole corpus of traditional place names that have been here for thousands of years that can be used and can really, highlight the initial cultures before my own that were here. But we are able to see that there's two ways that native place names influence English ones. That's through the borrowing of meanings or the borrowing of the sound of the name. And those of you that have tried your best to learn native Dene language, it can be quite hard if you're coming from English, learning the different letters and pronunciations of those because they don't exist in English, and you're using quite a different part of your mouth to pronounce those. So same problem with the initial white colonists, and what they ended up doing was when they tended to need that place name in English, they borrowed the meaning from the Dene people. So a lot of these are places like they'll come across in English like Caribou Creek, Stone Creek, Bird, Eagle Mountain, things like that, which was very interesting. When I compared how the Dene languages were sharing place names across between each other and the Dene, the other unrelated language families around the periphery were sharing place names. They also, there was hardly any divergence. It was also either borrowing the meaning or borrowing of the sound of the name, but the statistics were opposite. So it's generally the two languages were really trying hard to preserve each other's language sound of the name rather than the meaning, which was kind of cool. When the meaning was used, it was preserved, so it's kind of a meaning theme. So if you have like a Bear Creek, you'll see those things around. And so that actually has given us a really a much more stronger idea of how traditional languages have expanded and contracted throughout history before colonialism here in the state, which is pretty cool. So if Jim, I'll answer more questions about that, but I'll hand it over to Jim at this point.
So, this is my 2019 AJA abstract in the resilience of Dene generative geography, considering the net. Yes, ensemble, raise your hand if you've read it. Yeah, this requires reading. I can't summarize it now, but I am claiming that the names around the surrounding the north margin of Glacial Lake Otten have been in place certainly in the 11th millennium. I've proven it. And this is true toponymic resilience. Those names are 12 and 11,000 years old and newer, but the names in Tanana River Valley precede those. And this is the only claim of its kind in the world that some place names can be 10 plus millennia and fully analyzable and etymologizable. And it has implications for theories of language change. And the other term I use for this is a slow chronology. So you can look this up here. Let's go ahead. I want to say that the Glacial Lake Otten names that I've used in that paper were all in the 1983 Otten place names list with the same spellings and the same translations and etymologies. This is around the head of the Tyone River. There's a really neat place called Sastigi right here. That is the name for Tyone Village. Yeah, Sastigi. Oops. Yeah, Sastigi here is that means sun bump. And all of these place names that are in the paper they speak for themselves, they state the argument for themselves. Let's go to the next map. This is what the Otten place names looks like when the Nenana River meets the Susitna River, and I've used ascending numbers here for the Nenana drainage, and then I started the upper Susitna. I come downriver to upriver, and then upriver to downriver. And you can see these tremendous clusters of sets of names. This is what the Dene generative geography capacity is. So that this Tabenis not Tabenis Bennett and Dadini Seni Tabenis Lu Tabenis Lu. That's a moraine. That's the West Fork. They're clusters of names that are easy to memorize. And when you have a world-class traveler such as Jake Tansey, go to the next slide. Jared could make these travel routes for Jake Tansey that are completely, this is so world class. I mean, you can talk about these mountaineers and how they can cover their areas, and you should try walking some of Jake's areas sometimes. I mean, but Jake just knew this geography in real time, and he can pepper it with other sorts of, modify them with riverine directions. So in 48 minutes and in 10 seconds, he's covering 1,145 miles. Terry 2010 has a lot on this. That's the Otten travel narratives, if you're taking notes on references, which I hope you are. Let's go ahead. So this is from our web map and one of those snip features, where you can make a slide out of it. And this is, let's see, this is Satigi, okay, well, Tanahi, not, here's Satigi is here, he's the head of the Tyone River. I'm especially interested in this island lake or island mountain. And that's a mountain on the south side of Tyone River. And here's the mouth and then it's Kate Side is the one that really, when I learned this name in 1981, it happens to be the same name as Hogan Hill. And this guy, Jack Tyone, at his little place in Palmer, it was like January of '81. He drew this little map and said, Kate Side for this hill that's north of the mouth of Tyone River, and it's the same as the name as Hogan Hill. So that's a back mark and a foremark by orienteering principles. Let's go to the next one. Since there's some unnamed features, I've been toying with the idea of proposing 9 new official place names that would showcase Glacial Lake Gotthard. And I just was fooling with this the other day, but like about 4 or 5 names over here. But this big island is extremely intriguing to me. This is Mount Sanford, and then Boulder Creek is this stream off Mount Sanford. And I'm not sure what Big Island would look like 12,000 years ago, but it's a name. In Tanzai is a uniquely Dena'ina word for island. In Tanzai, Degalaya as island mountain wouldn't be said that way in the Tanana Valley. So there's connections with that. And the name for Tanada Lake is moving water in this stream. That's really the original, the big spillway in about 10,800 years ago. Tanahi, moving water, is related to the name of Tanada Creek. The old site that the Wrangels have found, Lee Reinhouse's article in 2019 is about this 12,000-year-old south site that's at the high water margins, upper margins of Glacial Lake Gotthard, and has continuous occupation. So let's go to the next slide. So we'll talk about Dena'ina, which I came up with a 10 region numbering system because of the complicated geography here. But 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and Kenai Peninsula 10. And it helps me to organize the names and allow for, I've got a new feature. Turn to the next slide. These are sequence numbers, and how can I tell the newest names in the Dena'ina database? I can do the auto number, a descending auto number, and see things I've done maybe in the last 2 years, but it's quite gratifying to find ways we can improve the names, even if you say that the language territories are abandoned, there's no speakers who know this, but with generative geography principles going on, you can name mouths for any stream, whether you have it in here or not. But we've had some real interesting discussions or things that are new discoveries. I've been thinking when I drove that oil well road by in Elchik for the first time, I was thinking of how I would rearrange the Dena'ina names inland from the Elchik. Let's go to the next slide. So in recognition of the wonderful film last night, I found these slides in that rebuilding Brown Carlson's cabin. And this is from the 2010 book edited by Karen Imanoff. But this is the best example of toponymic typography using USGS water and landform conventions, you know, in that book. And there's tremendous potential for this kind of cartography for learning the names, like, you know, this is called Contrashi Buna. It's kind of Laishi Buna, thank you. And we can get them right in the area of Brown Carlson's cabin and stuff is up around here. Is anybody here from the group last night, the film group? And well, John is, and let's see, where was his cabin, John?
Just keep going up the line there, right there, about, right there, in that little niche there.
Non-Kala, where moss is, where moss exists.
That's where Hammond's place is, that Nankala.
Mhm.
But Corey's or Brown Carlson's is 3 miles up lake from Nankala.
Okay, that's good. So there's really a lot of potential for various kinds of toponymic products. And we need some kind of teaching of this. It's not just for letting someone in the GIS get the map or someone else, you get this transmission of names as they're spelled, and you get all these typos and stuff. And people don't really know how hard it is to maintain cumulative place name lists, but it's a good challenge for yourself. And we have many products now that could be done. Let's see what I have next. I forget. Oh, yes. So I have this article Catherine Arndt and I published, and it's really cool for the Kenai Peninsula. In one date here is as early as 1829 that there was a coal fire here below Deep Creek in Ilchik in 1829, and this is collected by Wozniacki in a couple of weeks in August in 1842, and was published in Growing later in 1849. And let's go to the next one. Yeah, we could take some discussion here, and yeah, why don't we pause for discussion?
You want that other map up?
Let's see what the questions are.
Could you put up the slide that had your redrawn, way back in the middle of this 2023 map?
Redrawing the Alaska Native
Yeah,
language.
yeah, that one. Okay,
Yeah.
So what's Igigik between Central Yupik and Sukstun? What's that kind of darker purple represent?
This one?
Yeah.
That represents Igigik dialect of Yupik. What's her name? Who just did her dissertation down there on Yoko. That's most of those 5 names came from Yoko and from the older Bristol Bay place name database.
Okay.
So this is actually larger than the perimeters of the Alaska Native for the Dene language, and it's time transgressive. So we're talking approximately 1880 when we can say that we kind of know which names were in place, and essentially the in 1880 without this area, the perimeter, this is now larger than this, but the one on one of Jared's maps is 9% larger than the state of Texas. I thought someone didn't want to enjoy that. And actually, if you go back 6,000 years to the Northern Archaic, and the reason that they have names that are on North and South, you could say that the Dene occupation had no other alien non-Dene languages there 6,000 or 8,000 years ago at the time of Eskimo arrival, and was larger than 9%.
Yeah,
larger.
building on that, a lot of people, or non-native people writing about native place names everywhere. This formed an essential part of my dissertation, so I did a pretty extensive literature review on that. They'll use words like timeless to describe the nature of native place names that, you know, when you hear things like Book New or something like that, you're like, oh, it's just a timeless name, who knows how long it's been here. I was able to build a model that really actually robustly compares the place names to ecological events, that long-term ecological events that we can see change through Alaska, and also archaeological traditions. And we can look at any millennium and see the expansion of these Dene languages or contraction in the face of the Inuit languages coming in across there. So it looks like a lot of these languages up here in the Kuskokwim and the lower Yukon have been there at least 6,000 years, robustly at least 4,000 years. Many of them, we see Proto-Ahtna names appearing over here, meaning they had to come from Ahtna country, meaning that Ahtna country had to be established there at least by 6,000 years. And since Jim's dictionaries and the archaeological record of the Copper River Valley do not show any other archaeological tradition or language present in Ahtna country, the Copper River Valley, and we do have place names that strongly correlate around Glacial Lake Ahtna, which disappeared about 10,700 years ago, we can robustly say that we have Dene place names in the southern Alaska range for at least 11,000 years. That means the earlier forms of this language, which are documented in the Tanana Valley, have been there since the terminal Pleistocene. And we have, you know, our favorite one is on Donnelly Dome and on Fort Greely. Just Kwiatka'wake, and that means heart amongst the glaciers.
This is in Jared's dissertation as a kernel density map where a dot is separated by, represents 30 meters. So you see the areas where we have the highest densities of Dene names in Caution Habit for Koyukon. There should be 30 or 40% more names that aren't on our map for sure. So it's somewhat misleading and incomplete, but I'm using this in the Lower Tanana Dene Dictionary, which University of Alaska, they don't assure me, but they better, we're gonna get it published soon. And this is figure 25, M25 in the Lower Tanana Dictionary. And part of this shows the issue of the absence of substrate. There are no non-Dene place names in indigenous networks here, with very few exceptions. And then we have the hydronymic districts, which I wrote about in 1996. So my terminology for a theory I call the Proto-Dene Lex Loci has been developing for 25 or more years. And all the terms I've originally proposed, such as reverse hydronyms and hydronymic districts, is really cool. But a reverse hydronym is like Teklanika and Chattanooga when the dominant hydronym is not. And so it's an avenue among streets. And in Western Alaska, in Alaska, there are only 38 or 39 reverse hydronyms. But the fact that the middle fork of the Koyukuk is a reverse hydronym in the Brooks Range, Nika Whetstone is the only reverse hydronym in the Alaskan range. Well, why did they put the haul road through there? Let me follow my discussions with my argument. So the second reverse hydronym that stands out to me as most interesting amongst the 38 is High Power Creek, which is at the first stream on the left at the head of the Kuskokwim River. So that when the Dene are expanding, we can see the direction that they're expanding, and it's so brilliant. That means Black Rock Stream. Even at the foot of it, there's a not in Upper Kuskokwim. So I call that a double reverse hydronym. But they make these simple names, which means black rock, perhaps referring to coal or something. But at the same time, they're saying this is a new drainage and we're expanding into this drainage. I have about probably 500-word caption or essay that goes with that.
We're a few minutes over, but let's take a couple here and then we'll wrap up.
Well, I'm just looking at the map and how far out to the west, like, you know, Kotzebue Sound and Norton Sound, those pink circles go, and all I've been thinking is, you know, my Dene history is Cook Inlet, Tikatnu, and not all the way over to Bristol Bay. I mean, is there any archaeological support? You know, any archaeological record for habitation there, or travel corridors, or what were they?
That Onion Portage site is around here, and that Kobuk River had to be Dene, and many of the Inupiat names that are further downriver are borrowed or calques, translations of Dene names. So they're, yes, back there.
Oh, I was wondering, you said that the names happen to be 99% analyzable and etymological.
Etymologizable.
And I know, like, when you get place names, it's not that many, there's a lot of untranslatable names.
Mhm.
So how unusual is it that Dene names are analyzable?
What Tlingit has, the cognate Dene, non-Dene cognates still remain fairly small in terms of percentages of stems. And the Tlingit, anyway, I haven't worked with the Tlingit corpus, and I can't tell, for example, if Kashabara the map has some names, and yes, it's in Thornton, but I would know that in other areas, and the opacity and the difference between Tlingit and Dene is much larger than people realize. In the historical linguistic reconstructions emphasize the proof and the overlap, but why place names, and then you'll have names like Zizkat or Chilkat, that's Chilkut is Zizkat, or somewhere that name in Cape in this area, in Dene that means like a collapsed cache. It's just a collapsed rack, you know, exactly. Who said that in Ottenham? And I think that's what it means, but the Tlingit don't know what it means.
Just as a point, it made me think of my family history and my father and my grandfather. We talked about the seasonal rounds in Yukon, Central Alaska, from the confluence of the Yukon and Canada River. They would go out to the coast and then up the north, they would go down to Unalakleet, up, and then back down to like Arctic Village, and over to Fort Yukon and back down. That was their trade route. And then when I was a young boy, we would go to Anchorage for AFN, say, and we would all gather with all these other natives around Alaska. And I learned my dance, my language, and you know. We're waiting, and the Haida and the Tlingit come in dancing. And we're like, why are they singing our song? And so we asked them.
Well, the music diffusion is, I can't address that, but that's.
But the reason is, why are they singing our song? It's because people that crossed paths earlier, they said, we really like your song. Could we incorporate it into our record? He said, yeah, sure. And so there was this travel and exchange. That's the point.
Well, the music, that's untapped area for research about song diffusions. And Shempete has this huge song repertoire, and we'd like to see somebody get it all numbered and stuff. But it's quite different from. But no, the Otna and the Yakutat have a whole battery of songs that they've exchanged, which they're very proud of.
But building on, your idea of what you said, when every time that I find place names that are shared across languages, there's no divergence of meaning in there, and these have been maintained for thousands of years. And, you know, when Jim interviewed, the elders, you know, about these, it's not like these elders were getting together and conferring before they gave the place names to Jim. These were all independently confirmed. Every time I do find a place name, multiple languages that seems to diverge, I just kind of put a pinhole in it, and eventually I find some sort of clarification that usually they're on close but different features that were really close, and you're able to correct that. There really is no divergence of meaning.
So anyone here from Kisilov or Ninilchik, this is a tremendously interesting map for you, and I have a few printouts of this in papers. And you look for me at the dinner, and I have it in my van, and courtesy of KIT is wanting to do their van too. So, but there's something really fascinating about Tustamena, which is Dustubana, and why this is such a center of toponymic and geographic detail in the summer of 1842, but not the Kenai River. And Kathy Arndt and I have a paper that goes with this, and we talked about these, but the detail on going up the Kisilov River in here is really something to behold. And you look at that Dena'ina Hochul-Yishi catalog, the museum catalog, and there's a chapter there, all with Wozzisensky's artifacts collected that are in St. Peter, in Peter the Great Museum. And it's a beautiful collection. And this shaman doll was collected way the heck up there. And this is a place name on the map that's on the USGS, which is Shantutalach, which is in the summer the salmon run there. And it's perfectly audible. And the name for Starisky Creek has two names, Little Old Man and Stoktatent. And it's real plain, you know, Stoktatchaklus River. And so there's this mix of German and Dena'ina and Russian. And this is this Creole, cooking Russian Creole that's really was established by 1820 or so, when we have names like California.
This is fantastic. We're almost 15 minutes over time, so I want to make sure we have.